Hey everybody, I'm Tobias Wayland, the head writer and editor for the Singular Fortean Society.
And I'm Emily Wayland, the designer and photographer for the Singular Fortean Society. Welcome to episode 4 of Fortean Photography, and this time we are in England again to discuss the Cottingley Fairies.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Cottingley Fairies, as you are probably familiar, were a series of famous photographs that seemingly depicted fairies. So these were taken all the way back in 1917 by two cousins, a 16-year-old Elsie Wright and her 9-year-old cousin Frances Griffiths. And these girls were particularly fond of playing at a stream nearby the family home, and so they would often return muddy and disheveled, and as a means of explaining their appearance to Elsie's irritated parents, they would talk about how they had been playing with fairies. And so the girl's father, or Elsie's father, was skeptical, to say the least, and pretty unusually for the time, he was an amateur photographer who owned his own camera and was willing to lend it to the girls, and so he did, so they could capture supposed proof of their experiences with these fairies, and they actually returned with for the time, very convincing photograph of some fairies that they had said that they were playing with. And now Elsie's father wasn't necessarily convinced, but her mother actually was a spiritualist and a member of the Theosophical Society. And so she had actually taken this photograph because she had found it so convincing to a Theosophical Society meeting. And it worked its way up to the higher ranks, where it was actually seen by some pretty important people for that time. The Theosophical Society leader, Edward Gardner, and you might recognize this name, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the famous writer behind Sherlock Holmes. And they were intrigued enough by it to be fairly well convinced enough, in fact, where Gardner then gifted the girls with two Kodak Cameo cameras of their own to take further photographs, and they did, and they returned with 4 more plates that seemingly depicted more fairies.
And just for some context quick, this was in 1920, so some years had passed since the initial photograph was taken.
Right, absolutely. Everything happened pretty slowly over the course of a few years, as you would imagine. So, excellent point. Over the course of those 3 years, these plates were examined by experts, and now that we're actually to that point, I'm going to let Emily take over and sort of talk a little bit about the examination of the plates and what photography experts had to say at the time.
So, the leader of the Theosophical chapter that Elsie's mother was a part of,
Edward Gardner.
Edward Gardner, yes. He had taken the photographs to 2 different photography experts. One was Harold Snelling, and the other was Kodak.
Okay.
So Kodak had determined that the photographs had not been tampered with after the fact. So everything that you see in these photographs had to have been in front of the camera. So nothing happened with the film, the chemistry, or the development process, or anything like that.
So we can rule out something like a double exposure.
Exactly. And but at the same time, Kodak did refuse to give it a certificate of authenticity.
Do you think that might be somehow related to the notoriety they would expect to arise out of that?
I would think so. If you think about like William Mumler in the late 1800s,
Sure.
It was, he didn't want that kind of.
I think it's important to recognize too that the spiritual, I should say the spiritualist movement was by no means ever really mainstream.
It was kind of like a underground counterculture kind of thing.
Well, it was more of a fringe. It wasn't underground. It was more of a fringe, a fringe culture. So
Sure.
I mean, it's something that religious and scientific leaders of the day both had their particular issues with, and so I don't think it's any surprise to me that a large, mainstream corporation like Kodak
And they were
doesn't.
booming at that time.
Exactly, that they wouldn't want themselves attached to anything seen as fringe. Frankly, that's just pretty bad PR.
Right.
So.
And so Harold Snelling said, I'm going to look at my notes here. His opinion was that the two negatives are entirely genuine, unfaked photographs with no trace whatsoever of studio work involving card or paper models. Well,
Turns out, yeah, funny story.
so in the 80s, the girls, now elderly women, were interviewed, and they
For
did.
Unexplained magazine?
Yes, yes, that was it. And they did confess that the photographs were faked.
Well, they agreed that 4 out of the 5 photographs were fake. So the interesting part of this story, to me, before we get into the actual hoaxing process, was that now Elsie and Francis agreed that the first 4 photographs were fake, and again we'll tell you how they did that in a second. But the 5th photograph, so Elsie maintained that Fairies and Their Sunbath was hoaxed, but Francis insisted that it was genuine. And an interesting aside, while 4 out of the 5 photographs were agreed by the women to be a hoax, they both insisted that their experiences with fairies were absolutely true. So this 5th photograph, Fairies and Their Sunbath, was never agreed upon by the women to be a hoax, with Elsie thinking it was, and Francis saying that it was not. And also interestingly, both women attested that they were the ones to take the photograph, and it is the only photograph without either of the girls present in the actual photograph.
Right.
So it will forever, as well, and barring new information somehow coming forward, it remains a mystery as to, not only who took it, but whether or not it actually contains something paranormal. So the first 4 photographs that were definitely hoaxed were hoaxed in a manner that was honestly pretty simple, almost too simple, considering the stature of the people who fell for it, frankly.
Right.
The first 4 photographs that are absolutely confirmed hoaxes were really hoaxed in a ridiculously simple manner. So all the girls did was they found this this illustrated book that they enjoyed called Princess Mary's Gift Book, and they copied some drawings out of it, cut them out, put them on cardboard backing, and then attached hat pins to the base of the cardboard and stuck the hat pins into the ground to root them in the ground, and then took the photograph. So, as surprisingly simple as these hoaxed photographs were, there are, in hindsight, there are some very obvious tells from a photographic standpoint that you would think people would have been able to recognize at the time, but seemingly not.
Right. So if you've ever seen a picture of like a hummingbird, the wings are blurred because they're in motion, and the camera's trying to freeze, they're trying to capture that image of the bird itself so it doesn't all appear blurry, but its wings are still moving. Given the slower exposure time of these older cameras, if these fairies were in flight, which they are depicted in a few of these photographs,
Or dancing, always in motion.
in motion, there would be motion blur present, and there is not.
Well, especially at that time, right? Because the exposure time of these photographs was so long. You'll notice in every single one of them that where one of the girls is present, they're posing and posing in such a way as they would be able to be comfortable doing so for what we would consider, with modern photographic equipment, you know, a significant amount of time, you know, so they'll be like lying there with a hand on their chin or something, you know, so any sort of pose where they can be there for long enough for one of these to be exposed, basically.
And fun fact, when photography first came out, you might notice that a lot of portraits, everybody's very serious. They're not smiling. That was because at the time you had to sit there so long that it was just easier to keep your face still. Otherwise, it'd be blurry. And
absolutely.
by this point, people were having like household cameras, but it still wasn't great.
Sure. Well, and you're absolutely right. That was one of the reasons why people didn't smile. The other one being, and you, if you've heard this before, the other one being that, you know, often people could only afford one photograph of themselves, and so they didn't want it to be something that was considered silly or goofy or whatever. So it was easier not to smile. And if you only have one picture of yourself, it might as well be a sort of serious, accurate representation.
Right. And I think too, it's like that point being because photography wasn't as accessible. That's why, I mean, that's a good reason why there are only 5 photographs from this series too. Even though there's like 4 out of 5 were hoaxed.
Right.
Like you just did not have, like digital cameras now, you just snap, 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 and you got everything. You had to kind of save your exposures for that. So that's why there's not as many.
Right. Well, these weren't even film cameras these girls were using. They had exposed plates. Yeah. So, I mean, you can just imagine how expensive that would have been.
Right.
So photography at this time was still relatively new, but I still find it really striking that nobody examining these photographs at that time, to our knowledge, mentioned the lack of motion blur present. You know, I mean, the figures depicted are clearly in motion. You know, they're dancing or flying or whatever else, and yet you've got photographic experts.
Snelling.
Yeah, who are saying that this, you know, these definitely aren't just static cutouts. When, you know, maybe it's the benefit of our 21st century knowledge and hindsight, but it still strikes me as pretty strange.
And also, I'd love to go back in time and know the entire team of Kodak that analyzed this, because I mean, we don't have statements directly from the staff that analyzed it. We had like a collective decision, but we didn't have somebody's notes being like, hey, the wings aren't blurry because they're not. So we don't know. And they did deny a certificate of authenticity, so that could have been one of the reasons in addition to why they didn't grant it that.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so that was just a thought I had talking about that.
Sure. Well, and so even if we were dealing with, say, you know, not amateur, but a mixture of perhaps amateurs and photographic experts who made mistakes for whatever reason. So they didn't see what we would recognize as very obvious signs of these photographs being hoaxed. I have a hard time believing that members of the Theosophical Society would make the sort of knowledge-based errors in folklore that they did when declaring these photographs to be of fairies. I mean, the most striking one to me would definitely be the fact that in most of the photographs, I think is it 4 out of 5, or do fairies in the sunbath have wings too?
Fairies in the sunbath has wings.
So all of them have wings.
Yep.
Well, you know, I think any good student of folklore familiar with traditional fairy stories can tell you fairies were not depicted as being winged creatures. Sometimes they would be described as being fairly small, especially in the case of, say, pixies, which also, interestingly enough, pixies were most often reportedly seen dancing near streams in folklore and fairy stories. But again, no wings. So that seems like a pop culture reference, as you know, at that time, it was popular to depict, you know, fairies that way, but again, supposedly serious scholars in the Theosophical Society, I would expect to know better.
Yeah, and I mean, you have to wonder too if they just really wanted it to happen and be the truth.
Well, and that's absolutely a danger that
We deal with now.
we do. It's a real issue. You know, yeah. How much did they want to believe these were true, and how much did that cause them to to just mistakenly interpret these photographs in a way that you know, fell in line with their expectations and their wishes.
And it's also important to note that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle did end up asking permission to use the photograph, the first one, and then they took more, and then he used them for articles again. So you have to wonder if part of their motivation was, one, the first photograph had become famous, but two, he really wanted their photos in his article, and he was a famous guy. So you have to wonder if their faking was just kind of like a little bit of pressure from
Elsie and Francis.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, admittedly, by the girls, after that first photograph, they didn't expect that picture to go all the way to the top of the Theosophical Society.
No.
And to fool everybody.
They just want to fool their parents.
Of course. and so they absolutely admitted to feeling the pressure after the success of their first photograph, to the point where they really did feel obligated. They felt like they needed to keep producing these photographs because, holy crap, is that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle?
Yeah.
So, that's absolutely part of it. There was no real malicious intent in their motivation behind these photographs. They were kids, being kids, and they got swept up in the excitement and the authority, frankly, of adults taking them seriously and having expectations of them, and them having to live up to those expectations.
Right.
So yeah, that was absolutely part of it. And you know, before we forget, we really should talk a little bit about that fifth photograph. Now we've mentioned We've mentioned it a couple times by name. So fairies and their sunbath, and it's interesting for a couple of different reasons. The first we've already mentioned. Elsie and Francis never actually agreed on it being a hoax, and we can speculate on the motivations behind that, but it's not necessarily relevant. But what is there are some pretty distinct differences between that photograph and its and the first four of its predecessors.
Right. So we already mentioned that neither of the girls are in it. Either one of them could have taken it, and they obviously disagreed on that fact, as we just mentioned.
It's entirely possible that they both actually took a picture, and who knows which one of their versions we have.
And just to remind everybody that this was taken when they both had their own camera.
Right.
Because the first one, they used Elsie's dad's camera.
Yeah, that was the only one that we know of taken with that camera.
Right, because the rest of the four were after the fact. Right. But also notice how translucent these fairies are. They do look really similar, like in terms of like they look like the illustrations of the first ones, but I mean that has to be some really, really thin but sturdy paper for that effect to work. Because if you think about like bakery wrap or something like that, it would probably curl or flop over. But
tissue paper.
These are perfectly straight, and that's interesting to me. And if you zoom in, you can't see paper texture. And again, that might be hard to see because it's an old picture, and it's handheld blur, and probably some present. There's probably some handheld blur present, but it's very interesting to me with how upright and straight these and yet translucent these fairies are.
Sure. I mean, and that's a really good point. And So the fairies in this photograph are translucent, but at the same time, if they were using the same method of holding these, you know, paper fairies, I don't
Yeah.
know, if they were using the same method, well, there's no visible hat pin. So you would expect, considering how well you can see things like the grass and stuff behind them, you would expect if there was a solid object like a hat pin that had been attached to the base of these fairies and then stuck in the earth to hold them upright, you would expect to be able to see that considering their translucency. And maybe it's just me, but I couldn't find them.
Yeah, I mean, the grass is definitely very wispy and thin, but like a hat pin's very like straight and sturdy. And none of the blades of grass that you can see are behind it. I mean, is it possible it's back there and it's just like, I don't know, really towards the bottom and it blends into the grass? Sure, but I mean, if you're looking at this, it's pretty, I don't think there's hat pins in it. That's
Right.
my thought anyways.
Well, how do you think this photograph could have been hoaxed?
I think it's probably a thin sheet of something that's sturdy. I'm just trying to think of even like materials that are available at the time, but they didn't have that many different kinds of paper. My guess is that maybe they had like a thinner paper and they had blaring sunlight behind it to where they didn't need to worry about like, you know, them falling over and motion blur exposure and stuff like that. Maybe they propped them up on the grass just right.
Could it even have been something that they had drawn the fairies on and then held it up in front of the camera?
Yeah, but wouldn't you see fingers? Because you can see the fairies' feet connecting to the ground here.
Well, that could be a trick of perception. You know, like if you had a small object closer to the camera, it might look like it's, you know, somewhere.
Sure, yeah.
It isn't, because we're not really looking at a proper 3D image. You know, we're getting a 2D image, and then sort of projecting our own spatial perception onto it.
I mean, I could see that. My thought was, I'm going to borrow this for a second just to show you. This is how I thought they shot it. Like they're setting the camera on the ground straight at these fairies, just based on the perspective.
So it looked like it was straight on.
Straight on to me. And you can definitely see where like the skirts hit the ground. There's 3 fairies in this image. And it would be hard for them to like, if they're that flat on the ground, how would they get their arm up and through to hold them up? So that
Sure.
was my thought. I mean, and the fairies do look pretty flat to me too, which is why it's hard for me to say if it's hoaxed or not, but like the illustration and the
Given the information we have about 4 previous obviously hoax photos.
But like at the same time, it's like, I don't know what material they used to, as I mentioned before, I don't know what material they used to do this, but I think as a whole, this entire series is a really cool, interesting photo art series.
Yeah, I mean they are wonderful, whimsical photographs. You know, I enjoy them as a folklorist. You know, as a researcher.
Yep.
And yeah, I mean I guess it's too bad they're hoaxed. But I think the nice thing about photographs like this is that you know they sort of teach us a little bit about ourselves, and they teach us how to proceed. You know, how to proceed as paranormal investigators. I mean, without proven hoaxes like this, we wouldn't be able to learn how to spot false images.
Right, and I think for 2 reasons also, like it's very inspiring for one's imagination, but also I choose to believe these girls saw fairies, but given how difficult it is to capture paranormal subjects, let alone our pets,
That's true.
it might have been difficult for them to get these pictures of these fairies, so they're just like, well, how do we get these then? It's this speculation, but they both did admit to seeing it and held that to their deathbed. Why would they confess the photograph's lack of authenticity, but just not admit that part.
Well, if we're just speculating,
Right.
A reason why they might confess that the images were hoaxed, but then not, but then sort of like ardently maintain that they had actually seen fairies would be to save a little face, frankly. So of course they confess that the images were hoaxed because look at them, and once you have the benefit of a century of photographic technology and sort of where we are with that and how common it is for people to have what back then would have been a significant amount of knowledge regarding photographs. I mean, it was a matter of time. I mean, you could look at them and you would see that there was a motion blur, and you would see that they looked like fairies cut out of a picture book. But then when caught in a lie, like they didn't want to seem like they were bad people. Nobody wants to seem like they're a bad person. So it would make it seem excusable on some level to say, look, we really did have this experience, but the only way that we could get people to believe us was to hoax these photographs. And so I think that there is a motivation to lie about your experience in situations like this.
Yeah.
Not saying they were lying, but I will say that that's definitely a reason why somebody might.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, all in all, these are really cool pictures. I enjoy them, but I think unless, like, I don't know if they had, I didn't look into if they had children or not that know the truth.
Well, there are relatives and ancestors. I mean, there are people that own these photographs.
Mm-hmm.
They've been selling them at auction for a few years now.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, it's not something that they talk about publicly often.
Right.
Which is understandable. Like, they don't want to be known for this hoax.
Right.
So, at this point, we know for sure that 4 out of the 5 photographs were hoaxed. The 5th one is almost certainly hoaxed. And so it's pretty safe to say that they all were. Doesn't make me believe in fairies any less,
Same.
but it does give me pause when it comes to believing these girls' story of seeing fairies down by that stream. There are still plenty of other credible cases out there, and the fact is we're never going to know the truth behind their experience. And so the only thing of value, in my opinion, that we can get out of the Cottingley Fairy photographs is the experience of learning how to discern a hoaxed photograph.
So we'd like to know your thoughts on the 5th photograph. Do you think it's hoaxed, or do you think it's possibly real? Let us know down in the comments and we can have a discussion about this. And I think that'll conclude our episode.
Yeah, I feel pretty good about it. Certainly there's a lot more that could be said if you want to do a real deep dive into sort of the cultural aspect of it and how, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Edward Gardner's, personal experiences and beliefs sort of fed into their conclusions about these photographs. And, I could do a whole nother episode on that. Honestly, and
Maybe we will.
Yeah, who knows?
Someday.
Maybe we will. So believe me, we're aware of it, and we probably didn't just put it in here because we didn't have time. But we do love to talk about this stuff, so if there's anything that wasn't mentioned that you're really interested in about this particular case that you want to talk about, let's talk about it. You can reach out through the comments. You can find us on social media, on Facebook,
All the
Twitter,
social media.
Instagram. If you like what we do and you really want to be a part of it, we do hope you'll consider joining the Singular Fortean Society, and you can do that officially by signing up to be a member through our Patreon page.
And also, I put our website link, if you haven't been there already, and our social media channels down in the description box below. If you are not already subscribed, please do. We upload one of these every month along with other exciting video content. We've got a lot in store that we are working on and we're excited about, but you'll have to wait and see. So subscribe. And if you want to know every exact time we do upload, just hit that little bell and YouTube will let you know that we have a video up. So thanks for tuning in, and we are excited to talk about another photograph next time.
All right, thanks guys.
Thank you.